Welcome and thank you for taking the time. Following the recent hype around blockchain, our team from the innovation department had a closer look at the technology. While cryptocurrencies are one of the more popular applications, we identified smart contracts, another blockchain application, to have a lot of potential for the financial services industry. Today, we'll briefly walk you through the technical details, analyze potential use cases, and evaluate the technology before finishing up with some recommendations for your business. Smart contracts always run on a blockchain. Therefore, it is important to understand how the blockchain works as a basis for smart contracts. The blockchain is a system that lets a group of computers, the so-called nodes, maintain a ledger, which is why it is called a decentralized ledger. Every node knows about every transaction in an encrypted way, and users use a digital signature consisting of a public and a private key for authentication. Instead of an actual ledger, the decentralized ledger keeps track of all the transactions that ever happened on the transaction chain. The blockchain itself orders transactions by placing them in groups, the so-called blocks, over time. All these blocks together form the blockchain. By inscribing the transactions into a block, they will be immutable and remain in the blockchain forever. The inscribed facts do not only consist of transactions, but also small code snippets like smart contracts, which are especially popular for Ethereum. So what is a smart contract? A smart contract is a computer program which facilitates, verifies, or enforces the negotiation or performance of a contract. Just like transactions, smart contracts can be stored on a blockchain. Any user can create a smart contract by posting it to the blockchain. Once posted on the blockchain, the smart contract cannot be modified, hence it is immutable. Smart contracts require so-called Level 3 distributed ledgers, such as Ethereum, which support the scripting of smart contracts. Before looking at the different types of smart contracts, let us first define some common characteristics of smart contracts, which are derived from general contract design principles. Just like any common contract, the performance of both contract parties has to be observable in order to determine whether contractual obligations have been fulfilled. Moreover, both parties have to be able to verify each other's contract performance in the event of a contract breach. Additionally, the number of parties who have control and knowledge over the contract content and performance should be kept to the minimum necessary for the performance of that contract to ensure privacy and confidentiality. Finally, a contract has to be enforceable, a characteristic which is significantly simplified through the blockchain technology due to automated execution functionality and transparency. So how do smart contracts actually work? There are different implementation options, but typically Ethereum is the preferred distributed ledger technology. Let's consider one possible way of implementing smart contracts. Firstly, a traditional contract is decomposed into two elements, namely the contract evaluator and the contract manager. Both are smart contracts written in a Turing-complete language, such as Solidity. Turing-complete means that a language can express conditional branching and an arbitrary amount of variables. The first contract, namely the contract evaluator, contains the contractual terms defined in contract language and its semantics. The second smart contract, namely the contract manager, contains the execution strategies, meaning that it acts as an intermediary between the contractual terms and the event the contract concerns. Both parties jointly authorize the contract manager to perform actions on their behalf if the terms of the contracts are satisfied by signing the smart contract with their digital signatures. In order to gain the required information for contract evaluation, the contract manager queries so-called feeds. These interact with the outside world by collecting external data such as financial data or the signals of an IoT object. As smart contracts do not reach for data from the outside world for efficiency and security reasons. Through standard protocol for the exchange of timestamped information, the contract manager extracts this relevant information and passes it on to the contract evaluator. By linking this information to the contractual terms, the contract can then be evaluated and executed by the contract manager. There are different forms of smart contracts, which we'll discuss now. Firstly, there are smart contracts such as plain vanilla options that concern abstract data, such as financial data extracted from Bloomberg. This is the most feasible type of a smart contract, as this data can safely be linked to the blockchain by using oracles, which are trusted third parties such as Bloomberg, who maintain the data feeds on the blockchain. Secondly, smart contracts can also interact with physical objects that contain sensors, so IoT objects. An example would be an automated car insurance claim that is triggered by signals from a connected car. This form is less feasible as it requires objects to be smart, hence to contain sophisticated sensor technology, which raises a number of security concerns as IoT objects can relatively easily be hacked. Lastly, networks of smart contracts can form so-called distributed autonomous organizations, an organization entirely run through the rules encoded in smart contracts. The network is fully autonomous and manages itself. An example of this form would be an independent insurance firm that is entirely run on smart contracts. This form is fairly complex and prone to hacker attacks, hence it can currently be considered the least feasible form. After we've seen how smart contracts work in a distributed ledger system, the potential application areas can be examined. We divided these into 6 different categories of use cases, which are public sector, energy and resource, cross-industry, life science and healthcare, and finance and assurances. Next to each category, we identified promising use cases. As your business operates in the financial services sector, we'll focus on that for now. Within this sector, smart contracts enable automated trade clearing settlement and coupon payment. Furthermore, in the future it is likely that microinsurances will enter the market and insurance claims are processed automatically. Let's focus on the insurance industry. Given our 3-form model of smart contracts, a perfect application for this first form is a flight insurance. Once a flight is delayed and that information is written on a public but permission-shared ledger between the insurance company and the flight control, a smart contract can automatically execute the reimbursement of the insurance holder. Customers won't have to complete endless forms to start the process anymore, and the reimbursement will be automatically triggered by the smart contract. In a public but permission-distributed ledger, the customer can also check whether the insurance is administered correctly. This concept has proved to be a success, as can be seen at AXA Insurance, which is currently experimenting to automate the flight insurance exactly according to this process. An application for our second form of smart contracts will be car insurance, where the contract manager queries a feed that contains the data signals emitted from a connected car. Again, a distributed ledger system exists between the insurance company, the IoT-enabled car, and the insurance holder. Once the car is affected by an accident, it can automatically transmit all information about the accident into the DLT system and executes the further necessary steps. But how does this differ from our first form? It's just the source and the feasibility. While flight data is already connected electronically, a car first needs to become an IoT object and then needs to be able to judge the damage amount and the responsibilities of the accident. Our final form of smart contracts represents a completely new level of abstraction, the DAO. A real-life example of this form was the investor-directed venture capital DAO set up by ETH Zurich based on Ethereum. The DAO was crowdfunded in 2016 and had the objective to invest in all kinds of blockchain projects by collective decision-making without the involvement of any centralized manager. It had more than 18,000 shareholders but 0 employees. This concept could potentially be transferred to the insurance industry by forming an autonomous insurance company. However, the DAO was hacked later on, which resulted in a fork in the Ethereum blockchain. This illustrates that while there are some real-life examples of DAOs, the full commercialization does not seem to happen in the near future, as it's fairly complex and prone to hacker attacks. This leads us directly to the current legal status of smart contracts. Smart contracts are called contracts, but are they actually contracts under legal conditions? During execution, it does not matter whether the contract is legally enforceable, because it is automatically enforced through the terms and mechanisms in the contract itself. Even if there is no legal dispute afterwards, it still doesn't matter whether the contract is a contract under legal conditions, because it has been executed as specified in the contract automatically. But what happens if there is a dispute between the parties? Does the contract actually hold up in court? The question whether a smart contract is legally binding cannot be answered in general. To be legally binding, contracts require the following parts: offer and acceptance, considerations, intentions to create legal relations, and certainty of terms. This can be the case for smart contracts, but does not necessarily have to be. However, there is a rising recognition of smart contracts by US courts. Vermont, Arizona, and Florida already legally recognize smart contracts. The legal status of smart contract is not the only issue concerning the legal treatment of smart contracts. A big issue is the anonymity of the contractual parties. If the parties are anonymous, how is it possible to identify the defendant? So far, it also remains unclear which court is responsible for smart contract disputes, or whether a completely different institution will emerge in the future that will be responsible for smart contract disputes. Before we come to our final recommendations, we would like to briefly summarize the main potential benefits and limitations that we see for smart contracts. First, the automation of contract enforcement leads to a high efficiency of the whole process. The fact that intermediaries such as lawyers or other institutions are eliminated reduces transaction costs. Additionally, the decentralization of data within the distributed ledger provides visibility of transactions and thereby increases transparency and trust for the parties involved in the smart contract. Further, the distributed ledger technology and the use of cryptography for verification and authentication enhance the security for participants. The final main benefit we see is that the code used to program smart contracts eliminates human bias and subjectivity due to its strict and specific nature. It ensures that contract obligations are fulfilled as agreed and thereby avoids deviation from the negotiated terms and conditions. However, there are major limitations to be considered when thinking about deployment of smart contracts. When put on the blockchain, the smart contract is irreversible. It cannot be changed anymore. This raises the question of what happens when the code contains errors or does not reflect the intentions of the parties accurately. Also, the trustless and incorruptible nature of the blockchain could be compromised if off-chain information is required. In this regard, we want to highlight the security risk involved in using IoT devices to provide information for the smart contract, as these devices could be easily hacked and potentially harm the involved parties. Moreover, code is strict and intrusive and therefore might not be able to deal with real-world complexity. Also, due to the fact that smart contracts are coded, their actual content can only be read by trained people, such as programmers. As discussed before, the legal status of smart contracts is not clearly established currently, so not all types of contracts are legally binding. Cases in which the smart contracts are not legally backed up create a clear risk of exposure for companies that needs to be taken into account. Additionally, in the public blockchain, everyone can see the contract terms and conditions as well as pricing information. But in some cases, confidentiality is required, and a private blockchain might be the better option. Finally, the more complex transactions get, the more powerful and sophisticated infrastructures are needed to execute the smart contracts properly. The anonymity enabled by the distributed ledger technology can either be a benefit or a limitation of a smart contract. It depends on the type and context of the contract, whether anonymity of the participating parties is required or whether the parties need to be clearly identified. Having these benefits and limitations in mind, we recommend the following. Firstly, you should start with the specific use cases and keep opportunity costs in mind. Smart contracts are particularly promising, but blockchain, its underlying technology, is still emerging. Organizations have to start step by considering specific applications they can easily implement. As we've seen in this presentation, the most promising applications are the least feasible today. However, it is a must for companies to invest in smart contracts and dedicate the right team to it, as the opportunity is considerable. Secondly, you should work closely with authorities to facilitate the adoption of regulation. The current legal framework is not adapted to the implementation of smart contracts. Insurance companies have to collaborate side by side with authorities to embrace their full potential. Investments in smart contracts would be useless if the law does not allow them. The implementation of smart contracts won't be driven by technological advances, but rather by authorities, which need to establish the enabling legislation. Finally, you should consider the end-user endorsement. Even though the legislation is important, the acceptance by the end user has to be carefully considered. Some innovations develop too fast, which can cause distrust and resistance by the end user. Therefore, insurance companies have to educate both their employees and clients concerning the use of smart contracts. We hope that our presentation provided useful insights into the technical foundations and potential application areas of smart contracts to support informed decision-making about future investments into this new technology.